Very warm welcome to you all, fellow members of the Bibliographical Society and guests, future members, I hope. As the most recent past president of the Society, it is my duty and certainly my very special pleasure to introduce the presidential address of our current president, Margaret Lane Ford. There's so many reasons why the Bibliographical Society is fortunate to have Dr. Ford as its president. One of them is her encyclopedic interest and knowledge over the full, diverse range of our disciplines. This is a personal intellectual virtue enhanced by her position in Christie's as Senior Director, International Head of Group, Books and Science. Many of you will have read about her recent sale of the Shakespeare First Folio for a record sum of money, and you will have been impressed by the way she speaks about this to a very wide audience, factually, authoritatively, and engagingly. She can do that because she is underpinned by a rock-solid professionalism, already evidenced in one of her first major publications, the splendidly named catalogue, Christ, Plato, Hermes Trismegistus, The Dawn of Printing. Hardcore bibliographical work, for instance, on manuscripts which constituted printers' copies, or the identification of a previously unrecorded English incunable, a rare feat, not least within such a well-researched corpus, and her work on British owners of early printed books, undertaken for the history of the book in Britain. This led not only to a much-cited chapter in that monumental publication, but also some more, perhaps even more than a decade ahead of the trend, through the publication of the raw data underlying her work, now available through the Consortium of European Research Libraries, Make Things Ahead. One of her papers contains the magisterial statement: to reconstruct the past, it is often necessary to deconstruct the evidence. Before I hand over to Dr. Ford, I want to highlight a practical example of this abstract-sounding principle, which also illuminates the profoundly ethical basis of Dr. Ford's bibliographical and professional work. Throughout the 1970s, the Royal Library in Copenhagen suffered significant thefts from its collections. The investigation of bibliographical crime is not that easy, and the Danish police failed to live up to its reputation of the bridge and the killing. No culprit was identified, not one book was retrieved, but over 20 years later, the heirs of the thieves made the serious error of approaching Dr. Ford. The identification of her frankly obscure coat of arms led Dr. Ford to understand the implication of other evidence which had troubled her. A phone call settled the matter, the heirs received long sentences, and all the books, well, actually not all the books, but over 1,000 of the very important historical books are now back on their shelves. If you want to hear more from Dr. Ford after today's lecture, you can hear her own account of this in a lecture given at the British Library and accessible through the library's catalogue, a powerful combination of top-level bibliographical research and business ethics. But before you rush to hear this exciting account, please join me in visually welcoming Dr. Ford to give her presidential address to the Bibliographical Society, Bookselling and Bibliography.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christian. Anyway, you don't need to know anything more about me. I think I'll just, stop now while I'm ahead. Anyway, just to go on, and for any late joiners, I might just say that if you could just mute yourselves, there will be time for questions at the end, and it may help if you turn your video off with improving the streaming quality. So to start. So describing books is at the core of my professional life, and I wanted to understand better the history of the very elements of a modern book description. I have some familiarity with sale catalogs of past centuries, and yet I realized that I didn't know and couldn't find in one place answers to questions such as, when was bibliography sophisticated enough to distinguish editions, detect counterfeits, understand states and issues? What was the development of copy-specific details, bindings, annotations, provenance, decoration? What was meant by that oft-used adjective, rare? What indeed was the interaction between bookselling and bibliography in the earliest centuries after printing? This evening, I will outline the development of elements of an antiquarian book description which I hope may serve as a brief historiography of aspects of bibliography. I must start by outlining the limitations of my topic. I am talking only about printed books, in fact, only about antiquarian printed books, and I have based my investigation primarily on auction catalogs up to about 1740. My research has been extensive, but not comprehensive, and members of this audience might well know of examples earlier than the ones I cite. I must also stress that the development is haphazard. An element, once introduced, is not found consistently thereafter. Then, as now, a variety of sale descriptions, basic and detailed, coexist. So let's start by looking at the first surviving printed book auction catalog. Karen, you will need to allow me to share my screen. Slight technical hitch, there we go. That of the sale of the library of Philips van Marnix van Sant Aldehande at Leiden in 1599. Marnix's library included old books, a number of incunabula, one Low German Bible intriguingly dated 1450, up to recent publications. While it is the earliest printed book auction catalog, it is not the earliest record of an auction of printed books. Lotte Hellinge has uncovered records of several auctions, including printed books, already in the 15th century. Nonetheless, the Marnix catalog provides a useful baseline for charting the development of copy-specific descriptions. The entries are basic and give the author's name first, short title, place of printing, and date. The only printers ever named are the Estiennes, Combelin, and once Plantin. In those instances, the place of printing is omitted. The number of volumes is noted when more than one. The books were sold with two clear assumptions. One, the books were bound, and two, they were complete. Only exceptions to these two rules were noted. Unbound books were listed separately at the end of each section, and several are described as imperfect. Few decorative features are mentioned, but a little 5-volume Hebrew Bible is described as gilt. For such brief entries, they provide quite a lot of information, even providing visual clues. Language is indicated by typeface, Roman for Latin, Spanish, and Italian, italic for French, and black letter for German and Dutch. The entries may not be specific enough to allow identification of individual copies 4 centuries later, but they provided what the prospective bidder needed, and that is an obvious but important point to bear in mind, the purpose of the description. The level of description in the Marnix catalog remains standard, but not unchanged for centuries. Slowly but surely, more bibliographical information, such as printers' names, types, editions, and paper, and copy-specific information, such as bindings and provenances, were added, and I will look at these elements in turn, beginning with printers' names. The practice of listing only printers considered notable, as in the Marnix catalog, was already a convention by 1599. Conrad Gessner's great bibliographical work of 1545 and subsequent supplements advanced bibliography by listing not only authors and their works, but actual editions with dates and sometimes printers, most regularly Aldus and the Estiennes. If these printers were named, no place of printing was given. And for other less famous, but nonetheless notable printers, both place and printer's name were given, thus Cratendare or Hervagius at Basel. The practice of noting only famous printers and then dropping the place of printing continued, and we find in the 1609 sale catalogue of Josephus Justus Scaliger the names of Estienne, Aldus, and a few others. In 1643, Gabriel Naudet included the printer's name for most entries in his catalogue of the Descordes Library. Similarly, in Amsterdam, 20 years later, in 1663, in the Petrus Scriverius catalogue, also included the printer's name for virtually every entry. But these are exceptional, and printers' names were not systematically added until the 18th century. Prosper Marchand added them in his 1709 catalogue of the Foltrier collection, and it becomes increasingly more common thereafter. Singling out Aldine and Estienne editions shows their high status from an early date. They were also long-lived presses and were the subject of early bibliographical attention. The presence of illustration is only sporadically mentioned in trade descriptions up to the end of the 17th century. and the illustrations need to be a pretty prominent feature in order to merit even that attention. In the Marnix Catalogue of 1599, no illustration is mentioned, even though illustrated books such as Herbals are present. The 1662 Trichet Catalogue describes several books as having illustrations and sometimes specifies engravings. The 1667 Bluet Catalogue specifies coloring in a few lots, such as maps in a Blau Atlas and illustrations in a natural history work. And in 1684, the John Owen Catalogue describes an Ortelius Atlas as illuminated, as well as on large paper and with a gilt spine, a sumptuous copy. I find this lack of attention to illustration in the 17th century somewhat curious, because it should have been a selling point, and there is evidence at an early date of an awareness and appreciation of quality in prints, especially engraving. This appreciation was demonstrated in higher prices, with buyers willing to pay more for exceptional copies, i.e. engravings in first impressions. In Bowen and Imhoff's recent article in the library on Nadal's Imaginus, they cite the sale by Jan Moretus II of an exceptional copy commanding an exceptional price in 1613. When a copy described as with the best and first impressions commanded a price of 80 florins, almost 4 times the more usual price of 22 florins for a common copy. Once in the 18th century, specific attention is paid to illustration and illustrated books. In the Fautrier Catalogue of 1709, Marchand described not only the presence of illustration and its medium, engravings, but cited the name of the artist, Blomart, and added an aesthetic comment, elegant, in his entry for Ferrari's Hesperides. In his 1722 History of Printing, Orlandi included a list of books illustrated with woodcuts, and in 1729, the Aulenbroek Sale Catalogue devoted several introductory pages specifically to the quality and quantity of illustration in the architectural, festival, and other plate books contained in that library. Type was naturally a defining physical feature of the earliest products of the printing press. It was the chief physical feature of the Gutenberg Bible, noted by Piccolomini when he set eyes on early quires in 1455. And despite its rather late codification outside the printing office, type was recognized as a bibliographical tool as well as a selling point from an early date. In the trade, type's aesthetic quality was worthy of attention from the earliest days of printing, when they were described as beautiful, elegant, clear, by 15th century printers marketing their newly printed wares. A verbal description of typefaces does not enter sale catalog descriptions until the last quarter of the 17th century. In 1680, the Digby and Charnart catalogs specify some books in Gothic letter. The 1682 Richard Smith catalog notes an English Bible with fair, large black letter. The 1683 Heinsius catalog identified some as royal Greek types, and the 1686-87 Bowman catalog lists one book with littera primitiva. Noting type characteristics never really becomes routine in trade catalogs, even today, but it did feature in Matera's 1748 catalog, where the types are mentioned if printed by a notable printer. Although reflected in book trade descriptions only sporadically, did that work? Although reflected in book trade descriptions only sporadically, type did play an early role in bibliographical investigation, in localizing and dating books, and linking them to specific presses. In 1503, the Aldine Press issued a warning to its public about counterfeit Aldine editions, and provided the means to distinguish counterfeits from the original Aldine editions, including the type. The counterfeits, as Lyon work, exude a certain French aesthetic. Surreptitious printing added further stimulus to type identification. For example, in September 1589, a secret report sent to Lord Burleigh concerning the printing of the forbidden Marpelet tracts described how the printer of the first 3 tracts was able to be identified as Robert Waldegrave, the Marpelet tracts having been printed in a Dutch letter which matched one used by Waldegrave the previous year. As a book printed without mention of its place of printing, printer's name or date, the Gutenberg Bible eventually came to be identified by its type. In 1499, the Cologne Chronicle noted a single physical characteristic, its large type, like types used to print missals, and type remained the chief clue leading to its eventual identification. As Eric White has outlined, it was the first publications of type facsimiles in 1760, 1767, and 1773 that provided the necessary tool for comparison and identification, leading finally in the 19th century to the secure identification of the Gutenberg Bible as the first printed book. But I've strayed well beyond the time period of this paper to arrive at sophisticated type classification as a sophisticated bibliographical tool. Paper offers a variety of bibliographical clues. It determines format. It can aid in identifying undated or unlocalized editions. And it can be used to determine completeness, missing or supplied leaves. There was an understanding of paper as bibliographical evidence from the beginning of the 16th century. Returning to the 1503 Aldine broadside, warning against counterfeits, it cites paper as one of the telltale clues. It claims that the paper of the Lyon counterfeit edition is of poor quality and has a heavy odor. Neither trait is clearly defined bibliographical term, but perhaps smell should be. There is evidence that special copies were perfumed by binders in the 17th century. The Aldine broadside makes clear that paper was a bibliographical tool from the beginning, even if not a very refined one. But paper descriptions, still impressionistic, start to appear in auction catalogs over a century later. From at least 1680, the Digby sale catalog, some books are described as on large paper, and this becomes more and more frequent. However, it is often a qualitative and not a technical term, used to indicate large margins, and demonstrably not a larger sheet size indicating a distinct issue. Thus, it was used much the way that today we might say a tall copy. In fact, no recognition of paper as a bibliographical element is present in sale catalogs in the period I have looked at, with one exception. The earliest reference to watermarks in a sale catalog I have found is in 1729 in the Allenbrook catalog, a catalog that represents a milestone in cataloging antiquarian books in many regards. In describing a copy of a block book, St. John the Evangelist, the catalog compares it to a copy owned by the Earl of Pembroke, described by Mater, and states that the Allenbrook copy has the same watermark of a unicorn and another watermark that is difficult to see clearly. Furthermore, the Allenbrook catalog is also the first sale catalog to make the bibliographical distinction explicitly between true large paper copies, which it terms forma maiori, and those merely with large margins, grand papier. Not surprisingly, bibliographical awareness of paper predates its inclusion in sale catalogs. We find it first in Jean Mabillon's work on autograph letters and documents, published in 1681, in which the use of watermarks as material evidence is recognized. This was applied to books in 1694 by André Chevillier. In his history of the first books printed at Paris, Chevillier listed paper among the materials of books whose similarities can identify them as the product of certain Paris presses. In 1722, Orlandi included a history of paper in his work on the origins of printing, but it provided no technical description or advice on paper as evidence. Prosper Marchand's 1714 history on the origin of printing also contains a history of paper, and elsewhere in the volume, a list of undated and unsigned books at the end of his survey of early Mainz presses, linked to those presses by virtue of the similarity of type and the watermarks. David McKittrick has written that Marchand's conclusions may have been wrong due to a poor eye for typefaces and a misunderstanding of the paper trade, but he did at least recognize these aspects of important tools for bibliographical investigation. In exactly the same year, 1740, in Germany, Christian Schwarz similarly treated of paper as bibliographical evidence and even includes a folding plate reproducing watermarks found in early Mainz books, keyed to a table stating in which editions they are found. In 1745, the Baron librarian Samuel Engels described a Bible, later recognized as the Gutenberg Bible, he had seen in the library of the Mainz Carthusians, noting, among other features, that the paper was marked with a bull's head. By 1782, Ney de la Rochelle included a knowledge of watermarks among the requirements for a bibliographer in his instructions for a bibliophile, but it was in the first years of the 19th century when paper evidence was further refined and applied. In 1803, Serna Santander discussed the use of paper in dating undated editions and provided woodcut plates, illustrating watermarks in 15th century paper. The following year, in 1804, Bullard outlined how to determine format from chain lines, identify wove paper, and determine completeness in his Traité élémentaire de bibliographie. Editions have always been recognized. From the beginning of printing, some title pages and advertisements proclaimed that a certain edition was the first appearance in print. The next edition was proclaimed as the latest, most correct edition, and so on. And already in 1545, Gessner listed not only works, that is titles, by an author, but specific editions in his Bibliotheca Universalis, first universal bibliography. I might just remind people to be on mute. We hear a little background noise. Early library and trade catalogs, which tended to list the books in shelf, that is size order, scattered an author's works across size and subject categories, making it impossible to determine priority of edition at a glance. And explicit edition statements were not common before the middle of the 18th century, even if they appeared sporadically earlier. The desire to own first editions is a later bibliophile phenomenon, and yet it is a little curious just how slow the trade was to incorporate any edition statements into its sale descriptions. The German book dealer Kretzer did list in 1590 a Bible as a first edition, but considering the whole entry reads merely Bible, Royal Folio, Old, the first printing, 1476, Jerome's version, what he means by first printing is hard to fathom, since it was so demonstrably wrong, even in his own day, but he must have thought that it was a selling point. It was not until the third quarter of the 17th century that edition statements make their way into sale catalogs. In 1680, the Digby sale catalog lists a few as the latest, or the last, edition, and in the same year in the preface to the Charnock sale catalog, the auctioneer makes editions part of his sale pitch, stating specifically that Charnock was well skilled in editions of his books. And yet, aside from a few entries identified as best edition and one fourth edition, most entries do not remark on the edition. 2 years later, in 1682, the preface to the Richard Smith catalog states that Smith had compared differences of editions. Nonetheless, editions are very rarely enumerated, and in one entry, when it is, it's wrong. Best edition becomes the most common edition statement in subsequent decades, but this subjective term is rarely, if ever, substantiated by reference to bibliographical authorities. There are some exceptions, such as the 1706 Gouda catalog, identifying a few entries as first edition, and the 1729 Rawlinson catalog, where one entry is perhaps the first edition. The 1711 Schrader catalog goes a step further and comments on the first edition of a work as a footnote to a copy, a later edition being sold. But it is really from mid-century that first or early editions are noted in more elaborate sale catalogs. And the Harley catalogs from 1743 regularly note first editions, but just as frequently note more generically editio antiqua. Format is both simple and complex. Simple as a shorthand indication for size, complex because it is wrapped up with collation and therefore determining completeness. It belongs to a generic description of an edition, an ideal copy, and is necessary to a copy-specific one. In the period I am concerned with, sale catalogs invariably give format, at least in three categories: folio, quarto, and octavo and smaller. But just as invariably, these are generic indications of size and follow the practical arrangement of books on shelves. Format as size was an important piece of information to impart to a prospective buyer. Still today, who hasn't considered or reconsidered an acquisition, wondering if it will fit on his or her shelves? To establish completeness, of course, requires bibliographical skill, knowledge of collation. Reference to collations in sales catalog descriptions is a long time coming, but completeness is stated, or at least assumed, from the beginning. Early sale catalogs generally have a blanket statement at the front that all books are complete unless noted otherwise, and exceptions are noted. The 1599 Marnix catalogue noted a few lots as mutila. The 1678 Worsley catalogue noted a few lots that are incomplete. The 1680 Watson catalogue contained an undated Chaucer wanting the beginning. And so it continues with incomplete noted for individual entries over subsequent decades. In 1727, the Rawlinson catalogue noted facsimile leaves made to complete imperfect books, but without stating which leaves. Book collectors themselves had to be well versed in collation. Early auction catalogues made it clear that buyers should verify for themselves that their purchases were complete before collecting them after the sale. The auction catalogue of the Library of Richard Smith, sold in 1682, praises the remarkable bibliographical skills of Smith by noting that he generally collated his books upon buying them. Collation was understood by printers who produced the books in the first place, by booksellers, and by collectors. Bookbinders, too, needed to know before they started their work that the book they were binding was complete. And it is in the first bookbinding manual, published in 1708, that I found the earliest guide to collation. In the rather remarkable Buchbinder Philosophie by Zeidler, an amateur bookbinder, he explains the importance of collation before binding, and the need for any book buyer to establish for himself in the bookshop that a book is complete. After all, he warns, a bookseller might have taken apart one copy to complete another. He then provides diagrams explaining format, folio, quarto, octavo, and letters and number sequence. 3 centuries before the textbooks of our own modern-day bibliographical heroes, Bowers and Gaskell, and their diagrams so familiar to all of us. One might think that the binding would feature in sale catalogs. After all, it is the first, obvious, and tangible feature of a volume. But binding descriptions are sporadic and scant in the early centuries. This is not to say that they are ignored. Indeed, in a number of early printed catalogs, the bindings are treated in a sweeping statement in the preface, as in the 1686 Millington catalogue, stating that the bindings are sufficiently inviting, answering to the present mode, being generally curiously and richly bound, but no individual binding is then singled out for comment. Outside the trade, it was also rare for bindings to be noted in earlier library or collection catalogs, although they were mentioned for a few volumes as early as 1417 in a manuscript catalogue of the library of Domingo Pons, founder of the College of the Assumption at Lerida. I have mentioned one gilt binding noted in the Marnix catalogue, and there are 4 other instances of a gilt binding there. All are on religious books of some kind, and devotional books in general are more likely to have, and have described, more elaborate bindings. The next mention I am aware of in a printed sale catalogue is in fact in the Souvray catalogue of 1632, where a few books are described as bound in Morocco. They were undoubtedly singled out for attention as being different from the others, which were presumably bound in ordinary calf. Similarly, the 1643 Descordes catalogue specifies a few volumes bound in vellum. The Bassompierre catalogue of 1646 describes a few remarkable bindings, as does the 1662 Trichet catalogue, including a Descartes discours bound in black Morocco. These bindings were a distinguishing feature of their volumes physically and commercially. Then, as now, Morocco was an indication of a higher class of binding, and it continues to be Morocco bindings, or Turkey in English sale catalogues, that are most frequently specified. In 1682, in the Richard Smith catalogue, a binding on a Bible is further elaborated as gilt, strongly bound, clasped and bossed, and just a few years later, books are being described as richly bound. Dutch and German sale catalogues seem to be the earliest to localize bindings. The sale catalogues of Jan de Witt in 1696 and Benedict Karpsov in 1700 are remarkable in several ways, one of which is their treatment of bindings. While they do not describe the material or decoration of the bindings, they do attribute a nationality to some, at least when French, and in the De Witt catalogue, English. Again, in a 1715 German sale catalogue, a number of bindings are singled out as French. Binding descriptions become more frequent and more specific. In 1709, in the 1709 Fautrier catalogue prepared by Prosper Marchand, every entry includes the binding material, calf, morocco, vellum. And in the 1725 Cisternay-Dufay catalogue prepared by Gabriel Martin, further refinements are noted, all explained in a prefatory table, not just V for calf, but VF for veau fauve, plain calf, MR for Maroquin rouge, or MB for Maroquin brune. In 1737, the Lautensac catalogue similarly called attention to its bound books in its title and provided a key to abbreviations. The introduction goes on to say that if no binding is specified, the book is in wrappers or in paper with vellum corner and spine. A similar list of abbreviations was provided in the 1749 Larchevesque sale catalogue. As expected, bindings from enduringly famous collectors such as Grolier, Mathieu, and de Thou are among the first identified as such in trade descriptions. Jean Ballaston, who died in 1675, owned some 25 Grolier bindings, indicating a conscious effort to acquire them. No copy of Ballaston's 1676 auction catalogue survives, but the sale catalogues of his two near contemporaries identify Grolier bindings. Etienne Valouz, who served as Colbert's librarian, owned books from the collections of Grolier and de Thou. His 1719 sale catalogue drew special attention to books once owned by Grolier and by the illustrious de Thou. So too did Paul Petot, French publisher and counselor of the French Parliament. At the eventual sale of his collection, 20 years after his death, the auction catalogue identified 4 books specifically as in Grolier bindings. The descriptions are sparse. One is in Morocco, one has gilt edges. Otherwise, the simple identifications of Relieu de Grolier or de la Bibliothèque de Grolier suffices. Grolier is shorthand for certain aesthetic and also prestige and status by association. Bindings may have been identified as Grolier's, but the binder or workshop was not investigated or identified for another 2 centuries. Individual binders are already named in 1746 in the Rochelaine catalogue, where the preface states that many bindings, either in calf or Morocco, are the work of renowned binders Boyer, Dussel, Padelou, and Engeron, but they are not individually identified in the entries. Here and in subsequent instances, the binders named are contemporary to the catalogue and not historic, and it is their reputation as prestigious binders of the time that gets them noticed. The Van Uckelen sale catalogue of 1703 praised the bindings gracing the majority of his books as bound in vellum gilt, quote, "all so similar that one may rightly state that the like of it has never been seen in our country." But it does not name the binder, perhaps because it was common knowledge to a local bibliophile audience. It took another 3 centuries for books historians to identify the work as that of the Amsterdam master binder Albertus Magnus. Although much later, it is worth mentioning Semler's history of the development of the woodcut in Germany, since it bears on localization and identification of book bindings. Published in 1782, it gives detailed verbal descriptions of 227 panels and rolls decorating bindings of the 15th and 16th centuries, including basic edition information on the books they cover, a remarkable precursor of Goldschmidt on Gothic and Renaissance bookbinding of 150 years later. An appreciation of original condition creeps in at the beginning of the 17th century. Bibliophile Thomas Baker commented on 2 of his own incunabula. Books of this age are rarely perfect, and when they are, they should be preserved. And Christian Jensen has noted one of the earliest entries to draw attention to an original binding on a copy of Dio Cassius in an Osborne stock catalogue of 1739. Turning to provenance, the desirability of annotated books may be considered a recent, even very recent development. And yet annotated books were described and sought after from at least the beginning of the 17th century. That is, as long as the annotator was someone of note. In 1609, the remaining portion of the library of one of the most revered scholars of Europe, Josephus Justus Scaliger, was auctioned in Leiden. The catalogue laid out the order and entries as we have seen in the Marnix catalogue of a decade earlier, plus 175 of the entries were marked with an asterisk, indicating books annotated by Scaliger. The catalogue is rare, surviving in 2 copies only, neither of which has prices or names of buyers. But we know that Scaliger's protege, Nicholas Heinsius, owned some 200 books from Scaliger's library. Nicholas Heinsius collected books annotated not only by Scaliger, but other notable scholars. And the desirability of these annotations and associations was sufficient to warrant noting them in the sale catalog of his library in 1683. Books are listed there as annotated by Scaliger, Bez, Estienne, and Nicholas's father, David Heinsius. Often, it is the annotations made by the learned book collector himself that are the selling point. The 1663 auction catalog of the library of Dutch historian Petrus Scriverius notes that many books contain the learned annotations of Scriverius. Similarly, the 1682 catalog of Richard Smith identifies books annotated by Smith. The 1684 auction catalog of the library of theologian John Owen lists books annotated by Owen. The 1697 catalog of Edward Bernard, the scholar and astronomer, lists books annotated by him. And the 1703 catalog of the great scientist Robert Hooke identifies books annotated by Hooke. The desirability of books annotated by famous men is further attested by the preface to the Bernard catalog, which also advertises that it contains books annotated by great men, yet none of these, neither the great men nor the books, is identified in the individual entries. And Moses Pitt advertised a sale in 1678 as containing books from the libraries of noted scholars, including Gilbert Voetius, even though no individual book is so identified. Christian Jensen has noted the appeal of these annotated books is more philological than bibliophilic, lying clearly in the access to great minds via their annotations. Anonymous annotations, too, were seen as noteworthy. The 1696 sale catalog of Jan de Witt lists books annotated by named luminaries, but also by anonymous annotators. So too in the Karpzov catalog of 1700, where some entries describe annotations by Karpzov, Nicholas Heinsius, Matthias Hohe von Hohenegg, and others. Other entries describe anonymous annotations, and still other entries describe presentation copies. For example, one book had the editor's autograph presentation inscription to a fellow theologian, and another book had been in the library of Hermann Conring, to whom it had been sent as a gift by Johann Justus Stucke. The recording of these presentation and association copies goes beyond philology. Thereafter, annotated books become more frequent. The 1706 Gouda catalog notes a book with annotations in the hand of Scaliger. The 1715 catalog of IAP cites by name a former owner, C.S. Sharps, of one book. The 1719 Baluse catalog cites Grolier Provenance. The 1723 catalog of Groenewegen and Van der Hoek cites a copy of a 1477 Ovid as not only in an old binding of Grolier, but also from the library of St. Geneviève. The 1729 catalog of the Allenbrook collection specifies several lots as containing scholarly but anonymous marginal annotations, and so forth throughout the century and beyond. While notable provenance continued to be desirable, annotations become less so, with the impulse in the later 18th century to remove annotations in an effort to return books to a pristine condition. I was looking too for the 17th century equivalent of citations of bibliographical references. In the modern day, citing bibliographical references serves several purposes. If the bibliography gives collations or foliation, it indicates that the copy has been collated against it. It can also serve as a seal of approval, with significance attached to its inclusion. And conversely, if a book does not appear in a bibliography but should, it can be an indication of rarity. Everyone here will be familiar with "not in such and such." Those who work with sale catalogs of the 16th and 17th centuries will know that mine was largely a vain hunt, for there are virtually no bibrefs cited. The only 17th century example known to me is in the catalog of the collection of Abraham Henkelmann from the year of his death in 1695. Henkelmann was a German Protestant theologian and noted Orientalist, whose library was, naturally, strong in Islamic and Hebrew manuscripts. Presumably as an aid to potential buyers not as competent in those languages as Henkelmann, the cataloger provided short commentaries in Latin on the Hebrew title and refers frequently to Johannes Buxtorf's bibliography of Hebraica, Bibliotheca Rabbinica. He even notes when it is not in Buxtorf, so you can see the long tradition of this claim. Interestingly, Buxtorf's bibliography had been superseded by Bartolocchi's expanded bibliography, Bibliotheca Magna Rabbinica, shortly before Hinckelmann's death, but this newer work is not cited by the cataloger. The 1729 Aldenbroek catalog comes a step closer to citing bibrefs. In an extensive preface, it cites bibliographical references used in preparing the catalog, singling out Gessner, Simler, Frisius, and Metter. However, when it cites these bibliographies and individual entries in the catalog, it is only ever to show when the book being described is not in those standard references, unknown to Simler and Frisius, unknown to Metter. That is, it is justifying rarity and not supporting bibliographical evidence. In 1738, the extensive catalog of the collection of Adam Rudolf Solger was published as Bibliotheca Anonymiana by the German bookseller Johann Adam Schmidt. It is exceptional in many ways, including being amongst the earliest sale catalogs to cite bibliographical references. It not only names the bibliography, it cites a page number and even clarifies if it is citing the first or second edition of the bibliography for extra precision. It also cites bibrefs within bibrefs. For instance, Lot 16 is a copy of Abrami's Farus Veteris Testamenti of 1648. It cites Sincer's bibliography, Volume 2, page 1, which in turn cites Colaire's Anthologia, Volume 1, Fascicle 5, page 348. Vogt is the most commonly cited reference, and it is joined fairly frequently by Offenbach for his opinion on commercial value, but also by Reimann and others. All three, Vogt, Offenbach, and Reimann, commented on rarity and value, in addition to providing bibliographical descriptions. It also cites sale catalogs as a reference, often Mencken, and even cites bibliographical works citing sale catalogs, for instance, Vogt citing the Golius auction catalog. The motivation in citing these references is as much to claim rarity and its associated high commercial value as it is to provide additional bibliographical information. The final element I want to look at is simply the adjective rare. It was as ubiquitous in describing antiquarian books then as now. By nature, a comparative term, it begs the question of rare as opposed to what. It requires knowledge of other books, knowledge provided by catalogs of books, whether bibliographies, sale catalogs, or library catalogs. In the interest of time, I will leave aside a discussion of the history of the meaning of the word as applied to books, and note simply that rare, meaning scarce, is a fairly modern concept. In 1609, the term rare books appears in the title of the sale catalogue of Willem van der Meer at The Hague, and the next year, in 1610, the statutes establishing the Bodleian Library stipulated that the keeper's duty was to protect the books, singling out those of antiquity, rarity, costliness, and beauty. It is used in titles of Dutch sale catalogues again in 1639, ratcheted up to Rarisimorum, and in 1645. In 1643, Guillaume Naudet in Paris used the word rare in the preface to his catalogue of the Descordes Library, and it is used in the titles of book sale catalogues from 1672 in Paris and 1683 in London. While one may infer the meaning of rare as scarce from uses in the 17th century, it is explicitly defined from the beginning of the 18th century. And indeed, the Germans applied themselves especially energetically to the task. Classes and degrees of rarity were outlined in considerable detail and frequency in the next half-century. Notably, in 1711 by Wendler, in 1718 by Heumann, in 1723 by Serpilius, 1725 by Schellhorn, 1726 by Berger, 1732 by Vogt, and 1750 by Clement, to give you just some idea of the sheer abundance of discussion. Suffice to say that some definitions were so broadly constructed that almost any book would meet one of the conditions. Despite these axioms, rarity was a highly subjective term based on personal experience. In 1742, a sales catalogue prepared by Pierre Gosse at The Hague classified 3 levels of rarity, all based on personal experience. Uncommon books, i.e. those that I know are not uncommon. Books that I believe are more rare, or 3, books that I believe to be of great rarity. While a sale title or preface may proclaim rarity, I have yet to see it justified in an individual entry, anywhere up to at least the second quarter of the 18th century. In 1738, the Solger Catalogue did justify rarity in several books. For instance, in describing one lot, Lot 3, it calls it rare. It cites Vogt, a bibliography of books considered rare, cites Grushov's work on rare books, and cites a third reference work, which it quotes as calling the book rare. Furthermore, it states that virtually no one has seen a copy and that it is hard to locate. And it ends by citing both the new edition of Vogt and a copy sold in the Jacob Golius auction for over 17 florins. Lot 4 is described as Liber Rarissimus, cites both the Mencken collection, catalogue, and Vogt, and comments that no copy remains with the publisher. Other entries are described simply as rare, without further explanation. This blending of rarity and value exemplifies the phenomenon observed by others in the mid-18th century, that rarity becomes a function of the market. Value, not scarcity, makes a book rare. In conclusion, what we sometimes forget is the porous boundary between scholarship and commerce. In the case of bibliography, we shouldn't forget that early sale catalogs were bibliographies. At least they served the same function of recording, ordering, classifying, and provided the basis for comparison of copies, a vital step in defining a bibliographical ideal copy. I have shown examples of the Mencken and Golius sale catalogs cited as bibliographical references. Earlier examples are the sale catalogs of Nicholas Heinsius of 1683, Jacob Oisel of 1687, and Jan Gravius of 1703, to name just a few. The Heinsius sale catalogue was even used by Jan Gravius as a textbook for his lectures on bibliography at Utrecht in 1691. Interestingly, annotations reflecting Gravius's lectures in surviving copies are usually restricted to liber raris or editio optima, i.e. they are commercial rather than scholarly comments. Sale catalogues find a place in libraries alongside bibliographies and histories of printing from the 17th century, and a number were even reissued after the sale had taken place, further emphasizing their longer-term utility. There's also a developing self-conscious ambition in sale catalogs to become long-term reference works. This ambition manifests itself in highly refined subject classification systems, such as that applied to the Descordes catalogue collection by Gabriel Naudet in 1643, and to the Fautrier collection by Prosper Marchand in 1709. The Karpsov catalogue of 1700 lays out its bibliographical principles and states that its aim has been to create an auction catalogue and a work on literary history in its own refined subject classification. The 1729 Brochard sale catalogue at Paris states that the owner had instructed the auctioneer to prepare a catalogue for reference use. The Harleian sale catalogue also made its scholarly ambition explicit, stating in a subscriber prospectus that the sale catalogue would be of use to men of letters and would serve as a memorial of learning. But it soon had to concede the impracticalities of its own ambition, admitting in the third volume that it had become clear after only a few sheets were printed that the work had to proceed without the envisaged notes on editions and copy-specific details. The struggle between bibliographical ambition and practical production brings us to a fitting conclusion. I hope that I have shown not only that bookselling has advanced bibliography over the centuries, but also that some elements of a description that we consider modern, even very recent, have their antecedents over 3 centuries ago. Is there, in fact, little new with old books? Thank you.